At my grandson's birthday dinner, his wife introduced me as the shrew who ruined the family. But the present I gave carried a truth about her. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I smoothed the wrinkles from my beige dress as I stood on the porch, clutching the carefully wrapped gift in my arms. After 3 months of not seeing my grandson, I had spent weeks picking out the perfect birthday present for him. I took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell, my heart fluttering with both excitement and apprehension. The door swung open, and there stood Francine, my daughter-in-law, her smile tight and her eyes cold as always. "Olivia, you're early," she said, the words hanging in the air like an accusation. I glanced at my watch. "Only 15 minutes. I thought I could help with anything you might need." She stepped aside reluctantly, letting me into the home that once felt welcoming but now seemed foreign. The house was filled with elaborate decorations, balloons, streamers, and a professionally made banner that read, "Happy 18th birthday, Jeremy." The display of wealth was intentional, I knew, a reminder that they didn't need what little I could offer. "Richard is in the backyard setting up the grill," Francine said, not bothering to look at me as she arranged appetizers on an expensive-looking platter. I nodded, placing my gift on the designated table already overflowing with large, extravagantly wrapped packages. My simple gift, wrapped in newspaper comics that Jeremy had loved as a child, looked out of place among the glossy wrapping paper and designer bags. "Is there anything I can do to help?" I asked, hovering uncertainly in my own. "Son's kitchen." "Everything's under control," Francine replied curtly. I retreated to the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch, feeling like a stranger. When did my son's home become a place where I felt unwelcome? The answer was clear: when Francine decided I was a threat. An hour later, the house was buzzing with guests, family members, Jeremy's friends, and neighbors I didn't recognize. I stood in the corner, nursing a glass of water, watching as people greeted each other warmly, bypassing me with awkward smiles or avoiding eye contact altogether. Then I saw him, Jeremy, my grandson, taller than the last time I'd seen him, his face maturing into that of a young man. My heart swelled. Despite everything, despite the distance Francine had created between us, I loved that boy with all my heart. I started toward him, but Francine intercepted me, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "Let's all sit down for dinner," she announced loudly, steering me toward the dining room. The long table was beautifully set, name cards marking each person's place. Mine was at the far end, away from Jeremy and Richard. I swallowed my disappointment and took my seat. Francine clinked her glass, gaining everyone's attention. "Before we begin, I'd like to thank you all for coming to celebrate our Jeremy's 18th birthday." Her voice was honey-sweet, the perfect hostess. "I think it's important for Jeremy to know who's here supporting him today." She began introducing each guest with a personal touch. "This is Uncle Robert, who taught Jeremy to fish when he was 7. This is Aunt Clara, who never misses one of his baseball games. This is Mr. Peterson, Jeremy's mentor, who helped him get that prestigious internship." When she reached me, her smile turned cold. "And this," she paused dramatically, "is Olivia, the shrew who ruined our family." The room fell silent. I felt every eye on me, some shocked, others curious, a few even nodding in agreement. My cheeks burned with humiliation, but I kept my back straight, my gaze steady. "Mom!" Richard finally spoke up, but his protest was weak, half-hearted. Francine laughed lightly. "Oh, it's just a joke. Olivia knows I'm just teasing." But it wasn't a joke, and everyone knew it. The dinner proceeded with forced conversation and awkward laughter. I barely touched my food. My stomach knotted with hurt and anger. Not for myself. I had grown accustomed to Francine's cruelty. But for Jeremy, forced to witness such ugliness on his birthday. When it came time for presents, I watched as Jeremy opened gift after gift, expensive headphones, designer clothes, the latest technology. When he reached for my small package, Francine attempted to direct him toward another, larger gift, but Jeremy insisted. "I want to open Grandma's first," he said, the first words he'd spoken directly about me all evening. He carefully unwrapped the newspaper comics, a small smile playing on his lips as he recognized the old tradition. Inside was a worn wooden box, intricately carved with our family's name. "It's beautiful, Grandma," he said, genuine appreciation in his voice. "It's more than just a box, Jeremy," I said quietly. "It's our family's story, our real story. Inside are memories that have been kept hidden for too long." Francine's eyes widened with alarm. "I'm sure no one wants to dig through old papers right now," she said quickly. "Let's move on to the next gift." But Jeremy was already lifting the lid, curiosity piqued by the sudden tension in the room. His expression shifted as he peered inside, confusion giving way to interest. "What is all this?" Before I could answer, Francine snatched the box from his hands. "This is not the time or place," she hissed, her facade cracking. But it was too late. The box was open, and with it, a truth I had kept silent for far too long. The tension that filled the dining room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jeremy looked from me to his mother, confusion written across his face. Before Francine could completely hide the box away, a yellowed photograph slipped out and fluttered to the table. "Is that Dad?" Jeremy asked, picking up the picture. It showed a much younger Richard, his face drawn with worry, sitting at our old kitchen table, head in his hands. In the background, barely visible, was a stack of papers with red final notice stamps across them. "It's nothing," Francine snapped, trying to grab the photo, but Jeremy pulled it away. "Richard," I said, addressing my son directly for the first time that evening, "don't you think it's time he knew the truth?" Richard's face paled. He glanced nervously at Francine, then back at me. 30 years of silence hung between us. 30 years of allowing others to paint me as the villain. "We should discuss this." "Later," he muttered. But I was done waiting. Done being the scapegoat. Done protecting people who had shown me nothing but contempt. "Jeremy," I said, turning to my grandson, "that box contains our family history. The real history, not the version you've been told." The room grew quieter as other guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing they were witnessing something private, something raw. "Maybe we should give the family some privacy," someone suggested, and several guests began to awkwardly excuse themselves. "No need," Francine declared, her voice strained but determined. "This is just Olivia creating drama, as usual. Let's continue with the gifts." But Jeremy was still staring at the photograph. "I want to know what this is about," he insisted. I took a deep breath, transported back to that night 30 years ago. "It was 1993, I began. Your father was 28, not much older than you are now. He had just started his own business, and things were going well. At least that's what he told everyone." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Francine's eyes blazed with fury. "One night, he came to my house, the house where I raised him, where your grandfather and I had lived our entire married lives. He was distraught, Jeremy. He could barely speak through his tears. I could still see him so clearly, my strong son reduced to a shaking, frightened boy again. He finally confessed that his business was failing, but it was worse than that. He had taken out high-interest loans from some very dangerous people, trying to keep things afloat. He was months behind on payments, and they were threatening him." Jeremy's eyes widened. This was not the successful father he had always known, the man who preached financial responsibility and careful planning. "Your father owed $175,000, I continued. An enormous sum back then, and even now, he had no way to pay it back. These weren't the kind of lenders who would simply take him to court. They had made other threats, This is ancient history, Francine interrupted, her voice brittle. And highly exaggerated. I ignored her. I was a widow, Jeremy. Your grandfather had been gone for 5 years by then. I was living on his pension and what I earned as a school secretary. I didn't have that kind of money in the bank. Richard stared at his plate, unable to meet anyone's eyes. But I did have one asset, our family home. It had been paid off years ago, and the neighborhood had become desirable. It was worth about $230,000 at that time. I paused, the pain of what came next still fresh even after all these years. I sold my home, Jeremy. The only home I'd ever owned. The place where your father grew up, where all our family memories lived. I gave Richard the money to pay off those loans, and enough to start over properly with legitimate business loans. This time, a few gasps echoed around the table from the guests who had remained. That's what happened? Jeremy asked his father. Grandma sold her house to save you? Richard nodded almost imperceptibly. Where did you live after that, Grandma? Jeremy asked, turning back to me. I rented a small apartment. It was all I could afford after giving most of the money to your father. I had planned to live in that house for the rest of my life, but I shrugged. Family comes first. And did Dad pay you back when his business took off? Jeremy's question hung in the air like a challenge. The silence that followed was answer enough. It wasn't that simple, Richard finally said, his voice hoarse. The business struggled for years afterward. By the time things turned around, we had the expenses of raising you, the mortgage on this house. But you told me you built your business from nothing, Jeremy said, confusion and disappointment clouding his features. You always said Grandma never supported your dreams, that she tried to hold you back. Because that's what he started, telling himself, I said softly. It's easier than living with the guilt of knowing what I sacrificed. Francine stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is exactly why we keep you at a distance, Olivia. You twist everything, make yourself the martyr. The proof is in that box, I replied steadily. The deed to my house. The transfer of funds, the letters I wrote to Richard afterward, asking only for small repayments when I struggled to make rent, letters that went unanswered. You gave Richard that money as a gift, Francine insisted. And then you held it over. His head for years trying to control him, control us. Is that what he told you? I asked, genuinely curious. She didn't have to tell me anything. Richard finally spoke up, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. I was there, Mom. You never let me forget what you did. Every holiday, every birthday, you'd find some way to remind me of your sacrifice. I sat back, stunned. Was that how he remembered it? Had his guilt twisted his memories so thoroughly? Richard, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I never once asked for the full amount back. Not once. I only came to you 3 times in 30 years when I was truly desperate. I lost my home for you, and in return, you shut me out of your life. Jeremy was looking through the box now, pulling out old documents, letters, photographs, evidence of a family history he'd never known. There's so much here, he murmured, setting aside the deed to my old house, the loan papers with Richard's signature, bank statements showing the transfer of funds. Then he pulled out something else, a small notebook. My heart stopped. What's this? He asked, opening to the first page. It was my diary from those years, documenting not just the financial transaction, but the emotional toll as well. The loneliness of my small apartment after the spaciousness of my home, the hurt of Richard's growing distance, the gradual realization that I was being painted as the villain in a story where I had been the savior. And now, as Jeremy began to read a passage aloud, the truth I had carried alone for 3 decades was finally being heard. Jeremy's voice trembled as he read from my diary, December 18th, 1993. Richard brought Francine to dinner tonight. She's beautiful and charming, but something in her eyes changed when Richard mentioned I'd helped him with the business. She asked pointed questions about the arrangement, whether I expected to be paid back, if I would have a say in business decisions. I assured her it was a gift, no strings attached. Richard seemed relieved by my answer, but I wonder if he truly believes that's how I see it. Jeremy looked up at me, then at his father. "There's more," he said, turning the page. July 5, 1994. Richard and Francine announced their engagement today. I should be overjoyed, but there's a distance growing between us. Richard barely calls anymore. When I visited their new apartment, Francine made a comment about me checking on my investment. I laughed it off, but it hurt. I've never seen my help as an investment. Francine's face had turned stony. These are private thoughts from decades ago. They prove nothing. Let him finish, Richard said unexpectedly, his eyes now fixed on the diary. Jeremy continued reading. November 30th, 1994. Richard and Francine's wedding today. The ceremony was beautiful, but I felt like an outsider. I was seated far from the main family table at the reception. When I asked Richard about it, he seemed embarrassed. Francine explained it was an oversight by the wedding planner. But I saw the seating chart in her handwriting. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was becoming more intimate than they had bargained for at a birthday dinner. Should we? One of Francine's friends began, gesturing toward the door. Stay, Francine commanded, a tight smile fixed on her face. I want witnesses to this. Performance. Jeremy ignored her, flipping through more pages. September 15th, 1997. Richard and Francine are expecting. I'm going to be a grandmother. I tried to share the news with my neighbor Helen, but realized I have no photos of Richard and Francine. They never send any. I called to ask for a copy of their most recent portrait, but Francine said they were too busy to look for one. I remembered that day so clearly. The mix of joy at the news and heartbreak at the continued rejection. I had knitted a baby blanket that they'd never acknowledged receiving. February 12th, 1998. Jeremy was born today. I rushed to the hospital but was told only immediate family was allowed in. I am immediate family. I'm the grandmother. I sat in the waiting room for 6 hours before a nurse took pity on me and snuck me in for 5 minutes. Jeremy is perfect. Richard seemed genuinely happy to see me, but Francine was cold, asking if I could come back another day when she was feeling better. I never received another invitation to visit. Jeremy looked up, his eyes wide. They kept you from seeing me. When I was born, neither Richard nor Francine answered. April 30th, 2003. Jeremy's 5th birthday party. I wasn't invited, but I dropped off a gift anyway. A handmade wooden train set that had belonged to Richard. Francine opened the door and told me they were about to leave for a family vacation. I could see decorations behind her. Richard never came to the door. The diary entries continued, each one documenting another slight, another exclusion, another moment when Francine had engineered distance between me and my family. How she'd convinced Richard that I was trying to control him through my past generosity. How she'd whispered to Jeremy as he grew that I was unstable, bitter, manipulative. Don't understand, Jeremy said, looking at his parents. All these years you've told me Grandma was the one who pulled away, that she was resentful and difficult. She was, Francine insisted. She's showing you selected diary entries to paint herself as the victim. Then explain this, Jeremy said, pulling out a stack of cards from the box. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, handwritten notes, all from me to him, spanning years. I've never seen these before. We were protecting you, Francine replied defensively. She was always trying to buy your affection, make us look bad. Buying affection? I finally spoke up. With what? Handmade gifts? Cards? The little pension? I lived on after giving everything to save your father's business? Richard's face had grown increasingly troubled as Jeremy read from the diary. Now he looked directly at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in decades. "Mom," he said quietly, "if what you're saying is true, why didn't you speak up before now? Why keep all this documentation secret for so long?" I sighed heavily, feeling the weight of all those silent years. Because I thought it would only push you further away. And because. I hesitated, then finished softly. Because I was protecting you. Protecting me? From what? From the truth about how deep your troubles were back then. From having to face what you did, taking my home and then shutting me out of your life. I thought if I just waited patiently, if I didn't make waves, eventually, you'd remember who I really was, who we were to each other. Jeremy was still going through the box, pulling out more evidence, photographs, receipts, bank statements. "There's something else here," he said, extracting a folded newspaper article. He opened it carefully, the yellowed paper fragile with age. His eyes widened as he scanned the headline. "Local businessman narrowly escapes charges in investment. Scandal?" he read aloud. "Dad, is this about you?" Richard paled. Francine grabbed for the article, but Jeremy moved it out of her reach. "The part you always left out," I said quietly, looking at my son. "The reason those loans were so dangerous. It wasn't just money you owed, was it, Richard?" The room fell completely silent as the final, darkest secret of our family hovered on. The edge of revelation. Richard's hands trembled as he reached for his water glass. The newspaper article lay on the table between us, its headline screaming a truth he'd buried for decades. "It wasn't just about the money," I said softly. "You were in trouble with the law." "Dad?" Jeremy's voice cracked with disbelief. Richard closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, resignation written across his face. "It was complicated. I was young, desperate to succeed. You made promises to investors that you couldn't keep," I finished for him. "You diverted funds. You were facing serious charges, Richard." "I never intended to defraud anyone," Richard protested weakly. "The market turned. Investments went bad. I was just trying to keep things afloat until they improved." "The investigators didn't see it that way," I reminded him. "They were building a case against you." Jeremy scanned the article, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "It says charges were abruptly dropped due to lack of sufficient evidence and administrative issues with the case." He looked up sharply. "What really happened?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Francine's face had lost its hostility, replaced by something closer to fear. "Tell him," I urged Richard. "Tell him why those charges disappeared." Richard swallowed hard. "Mom used her connections." "Connections?" Jeremy repeated, confused. "My brother, your great-uncle William," I explained. "He was a judge, not in the jurisdiction handling Richard's case, but he knew people. I begged him to help, to find a way to make it go away." "You did that?" Jeremy asked me. I nodded. "William called in favors. Evidence disappeared. Paperwork was mishandled. The case fell apart." That's illegal," Jeremy whispered. "Yes," I admitted. "And William risked his entire career to do it. He died 2 years later, and we never spoke of it again." "You did all that, sold your house, compromised your own brother's ethics to save Dad?" Jeremy's voice was tinged with awe and horror. "He was my son," I said simply. "I would have done anything for him." Richard's face crumpled. 30 years of denial, of distorted memories, of believing his own revised version of history. All of it collapsed under the weight of the evidence before him. "I convinced myself that you helped because you wanted to control me," he said hoarsely. "That your money came with strings attached." "The only string was that I wanted to remain in your life," I replied. "To know my son, to know my grandson." Francine stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is ancient history. What's the point of dredging it up now, on Jeremy's birthday of all days? Because it's time for the truth, I said, meeting her gaze steadily. For 18 years, you've painted me as the villain in Jeremy's life. You've twisted Richard's memories until even he believed your version of events. Everything I did was for my family, Francine insisted, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. No, Jeremy said, surprising us all. Everything Grandma did was for her family. What you did was build a wall to keep her out. He turned to me, eyes shining with unshed tears. Why didn't you fight harder, Grandma? Why did you let them push you away? It was the question that had haunted me for years. Why had I accepted my exile so completely? Why had I allowed them to rewrite our history? I thought it was temporary, I admitted. I kept believing that Richard would remember the truth on his own, that he'd see through the manipulation. And I was afraid that if I pushed too hard, I'd lose even the small connection I still had. And you thought giving him this box now would change things? Francine asked, her tone sharp but less certain than before. I thought Jeremy deserved to know his family's real history before he goes out into the world, I said. He's 18. Now, a man, old enough to make his own judgments. There's something else here, Jeremy said suddenly, his attention back on the box. He pulled out a small velvet pouch. What's this? I smiled faintly. Open it. Jeremy loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into his palm. A set of keys fell out, along with a folded document. Keys? He asked, puzzled. To my apartment, I explained. And the deed to it. Jeremy unfolded the document, his eyes widening as he read. You're giving me your apartment? But where will you live? I'm not giving it to you to live in, I clarified. It's an investment property now. I bought it 10 years ago when the building converted to condos. It's in a good neighborhood, values are rising. I've been renting it out, saving the income. I reached into the box and extracted a bank statement, handing it to Jeremy. This is the account where I've been depositing the rental income. It's in your name, a trust that matures today, on your 18th birthday. Jeremy stared at the balance, his jaw dropping. Grandma, this is over $100,000. Francine made a strangled sound. Richard sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. How? Richard finally managed. How did you afford to buy the apartment? To save this much? I worked 3 jobs after retiring from the school, I said. Night shifts at the hospital doing administrative work, weekend receptionist at a salon, plus my pension. I lived simply, saved everything I could. For Jeremy? Richard asked. For my family, I corrected him. I never stopped believing we were a family, Richard, even when you shut me out. Jeremy was still staring at the bank statement. All these years, while Mom and Dad were telling me you were bitter and selfish, you were working multiple jobs to save money for me? I nodded. I couldn't be present in your life the way I wanted. They wouldn't allow it. But I could make sure you had a foundation for your future. We would have provided for him, Francine snapped, but there was a defensive note in her voice now. I'm sure you would have, I agreed. But this isn't about providing. It's about love. It's about the sacrifices we make for the people who matter to us. Jeremy carefully replaced the bank statement and keys in the box, then did something that shocked everyone. He picked up the box and moved to sit beside me at the far end of the table. I want to hear more, he said quietly. I want to know everything. Richard watched this movement, the physical shifting of allegiance, with a stricken expression. Jeremy, he began, you don't understand how complicated this is. I understand perfectly, Jeremy interrupted. Grandma sacrificed everything for you, and you let her be pushed out of our lives. You let me believe she was someone she wasn't. The silence that followed was deafening. The remaining party guests looked desperately uncomfortable, witnessing The implosion of a family myth that had stood for decades. Then Richard did something I never expected. He stood up and moved to my other side, taking the seat next to me. "You're right," he said to Jeremy. "And I need to hear the truth too. All of it." Francine remained at the other end of the table, alone, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling before her eyes. "Richard," she began, a warning in her voice. But for the first time in our long, painful history, my son didn't look to his wife for direction. Instead, he turned to me, his eyes clear and present in a way they hadn't been for 30 years. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said softly. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix this, Richard." Francine's voice cut through the moment, sharp and cold. She stood up, smoothing her designer dress with trembling hands. 30 years of marriage? And you're choosing her side just like that? "This isn't about sides," Richard replied, his voice steadier than before. "It's about the truth." The remaining party guests began to slip away, murmuring awkward excuses. Within minutes, only family remained in the dining room: Richard, Francine, Jeremy, and me. Jeremy was still examining items from the memory box. He pulled out a small bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. "What are these?" he asked. "Letters I wrote to you," I explained. "Birthday cards, holiday greetings, notes about things I thought you'd find interesting. Things I sent that I suspect you never received." Jeremy untied the ribbon and opened one. "Dear Jeremy," he read aloud. "Happy 10th birthday. I saw a model rocket launch at the park yesterday and thought of how much you'd enjoy it. Remember when we built that small rocket when you were 6? Your eyes lit up when it soared into the sky." He looked up, confused. "We built a rocket together? I don't remember that." "It was the last time your mother allowed me to spend a day alone with you," I said quietly. "After that, there were always excuses why it wasn't convenient for me to see you." Francine paced the room, her composure cracking. "This is ridiculous. You're making it sound like I orchestrated some grand conspiracy. You were clingy, judgmental, always finding subtle ways to criticize how we were raising Jeremy." "Was I?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Tell me one specific example." Francine faltered, her mouth opening and closing. You were always bringing up how Richard was raised, implying we weren't doing things right." "That's not true," Richard said suddenly. "Mom rarely gave parenting advice, even when I asked for it. I remember being surprised by how hands-off she was." He looked at me with dawning realization. "You were afraid of overstepping, weren't you?" I nodded. After the first few times Francine accused me of interfering, I became very careful. I didn't want to give any reason for further distance. Jeremy had found a small photo album in the box. "These are pictures of me," he said, flipping through pages. "But I've never seen most of them." "Your school sent them to me," I explained. "I called every year and asked them to mail me copies of your school photos, your sports team pictures. It was the only way I could watch you grow up." "That's stalking," Francine snapped. "You went behind our backs." "It's public information," I replied calmly. "Any grandparent can request it." I didn't interfere. I just wanted to see my grandson's face. Jeremy continued looking through the album, his expression softening. "You came to my baseball games?" "Everyone I knew about, I confirmed." "I sat in the far corner of the bleachers. I didn't approach you afterward. I just wanted to see you play." "You were there?" Richard asked, stunned. "All those years?" "Of course I was there. He's my grandson." Richard's face crumpled. "I never saw you." "You weren't looking for me," I said gently. Francine slammed her hand on the table. "Enough of this pity party. Richard, are you seriously falling for this manipulation? She's trying to turn you against me, against the life we've built." "Our life was built on a lie," Richard replied, his voice firm. A lie you helped me believe. What lie? Francine demanded. That your mother expected gratitude and control in exchange for her help? That wasn't a lie. It was obvious. No, I interjected quietly. The lie was that I ever asked for anything in return. The lie was that I was trying to control Richard. The truth is that I let him go, even when it broke my heart. Because I thought that's what he wanted. Jeremy stood up, the box clutched in his arms. I need some air, he said abruptly, and walked out to the backyard. After a moment's hesitation, Richard followed him, leaving me alone with Francine. The silence between us stretched taut and dangerous. Francine glared at me, her perfect makeup unable to hide the fury beneath. Congratulations, she finally said, her voice dripping with venom. You finally got what you wanted. You've turned them against me. That was never my intention, I replied. I only wanted the truth to be known. The truth, she scoffed. Your version of it. No, Francine. The documented truth. The provable truth. I gestured toward the doorway where Richard and Jeremy had disappeared. They're not stupid. They can see the evidence for themselves. She crossed her arms, a defensive posture I'd seen so many times before. Why now? After all these years, why did you decide to do this now? I considered her question carefully. Because I'm getting older. Because secrets and lies are heavy burdens to carry. And because Jeremy deserves to know his family's true history before he makes his own way in the world. You've destroyed everything, she whispered. But there was something different in her voice now. Not just anger, but fear. I haven't destroyed anything that was real, I replied. Through the window, I could see Richard and Jeremy in the backyard, heads bent close in intense conversation. 30 years of carefully constructed narrative were unraveling, and Francine knew it. He'll never forgive you for this, I said softly. Not because you kept me away. He was complicit in that. But because you made him complicit in erasing the mother who sacrificed everything for him. Francine's carefully maintained facade finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks, smearing her perfect makeup. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. I was protecting him. From what? From the shame. From knowing what he'd done, taking your home, the legal trouble, all of it. I saw how it was eating him alive. The guilt. I helped him rewrite the story so he could live with himself. For the first time, I glimpsed something like genuine emotion from her. A desperate, misguided love for my son. And for that, you had to make me the villain? I asked. She wiped her tears, leaving streaks of mascara across her cheeks. It was easier that way. Cleaner. For whom? She had no answer to that. Through the window, I saw Richard embrace Jeremy, both of them wiping tears from their faces. Then they turned toward the house, their expressions set with resolve. The door opened, and they walked back in. The confrontation I had avoided for 30 years was finally, inevitably, here. Richard and Jeremy stood in the doorway, their faces showing the aftermath of tears, but also a new determination. The dining room felt charged with the weight of 3 decades of silence finally broken. I've been an idiot, Richard said simply, looking directly at me. A coward. Richard, don't, Francine began, but he silenced her with a look. No more, Francine. No more excuses. No more lies. He turned back to me. Mom, I don't even know where to begin. I reached for his hand across the table. You just did. Jeremy pulled up a chair between us. Dad told me everything. How after you helped him, he couldn't face what he'd done. Taking your home, letting you struggle while he built his business. How it was easier to believe you were controlling than to acknowledge he'd abandoned you. Richard nodded, his expression pained. And Francine. She didn't create the distance between us, Mom. She encouraged it, yes, but the weakness was in me. I wanted to believe her version because it absolved me of guilt. Francine remained standing, arms wrapped around herself as if for protection. You're making it sound calculated. I was trying to protect our family. By erasing mine? I asked softly. The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Jeremy reached into the box and pulled out a small, worn teddy bear. What's this? A smile touched my lips. Your father's. He called him Mr. Beans because of the dried beans inside that made a soft rattling sound. Richard wouldn't sleep without him until he was nearly 10. Richard reached for the stuffed animal, his fingers trembling slightly. I thought he was lost in a move. You kept him all these years? Of course I did. I've kept everything that mattered. Even your memories of me? After what I did? Especially those, I assured him. You're my son, Richard. Nothing changes that. Not distance, not misunderstandings, not even years of silence. Francine made a small, choked sound. For the first time, I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just my longtime adversary, but a woman afraid of losing everything she'd built. Francine, I said carefully, I didn't come here today to destroy your family. Then why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. To reclaim my place in it, I replied. Not to take yours. Richard stood up, moving to his wife's side. This doesn't have to be a competition, Francine. My mother isn't a threat to you. She never was. You don't understand, Francine said, her composure cracking. If she's right, if I've been wrong all these years, what does that make me? Human, I suggested. Flawed, like all of us. Jeremy had been quiet, absorbing everything. Now he spoke, his voice steady beyond his years. I want to know my grandmother. Really know her, not the version I've been told about. Of course, Richard agreed immediately, then, cautiously, to Francine. That's reasonable, isn't it? Francine's shoulders slumped slightly. Not surrender, but perhaps resignation. Do whatever you want. You will anyway. Mom, Jeremy said, surprising us all by addressing Francine directly. This isn't about choosing sides. It's about fixing something that never should have been broken. Richard looked at his son with undisguised pride. Then he turned to me, his expression solemn. The money you gave Jeremy, I want to match it. Double it. It's the least I can do. That's not necessary, I began. But he shook his head. It's not about necessity, Mom. It's about finally doing the right thing. I felt something unclench inside. Me? A tightness I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten it was there. Not just about the money, but about being heard, being believed. There's one more thing in here, Jeremy said, reaching to the bottom of the box. He pulled out a small velvet jewelry box. What's this? Open it, I urged. Inside was a simple silver locket on a delicate chain. Jeremy carefully opened it to reveal 2 photos, a baby Richard on one side and a baby Jeremy on the other. Had it made when you were born? I explained. I've kept it with me every day since. The 2 most important people in my life. Jeremy closed the locket and handed it back to me. You should wear it now. No more hiding. With trembling fingers, I fastened the chain around my neck, feeling the weight of the locket settle against my heart. No more hiding, indeed. Richard cleared his throat. Mom, would you? Would you stay? The party's pretty much ruined. But maybe we could have dinner. Just family. Family. The word I'd waited 30 years to hear again. I'd like that, I said simply. Francine hesitated, then nodded stiffly. Not enthusiastic, but not opposing it either. A beginning. As Richard and Jeremy began clearing the abandoned party decorations, I found myself alone with Francine for a moment. This won't be easy, she said quietly. For any of us. Most important things aren't, I agreed. I'm not going to suddenly pretend we're best friends. I wouldn't expect that, I assured her. But maybe we could try being civil. For Richard's sake, for Jeremy's. She studied me for a long moment, then gave a single, decisive nod. I can do civil. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even truly peace. But it was acknowledgement, and after 30 years of being treated as invisible, that felt like a victory. Later that evening, as we sat around the dining table eating reheated birthday dinner, I watched Richard laugh at something Jeremy said, a real laugh, unguarded and genuine. Jeremy was animated, asking me questions about his father as a child, about my life, about the years we'd missed. Even Francine contributed occasionally, her responses terse but not hostile. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward silences, moments of tension when old habits threatened to resurface. Healing would take time, perhaps years. But as I sat there, the silver locket warm against my skin, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: belonging. The truth had finally been spoken, the silence broken. The careful fiction Francine had constructed had crumbled, but in its place, something authentic was beginning to grow. I had come to this house expecting to be treated as an outsider once again. Instead, I was reclaiming my rightful place, not as an intruder, but as the mother and grandmother I had always been. "More wine, Mom?" Richard asked, holding up the bottle. Mom, not Olivia, not Jeremy's grandmother. Mom. I smiled and held out my glass. Yes, please. Freedom, I realized, wasn't about escaping the past. It was about bringing it into the light, where its power to harm could finally fade. The memory box had served its purpose. Now it was time to make new memories, together.